The morning fog still covered the river when the three ships appeared on the horizon, their sails stained by the salt of the ocean they had crossed for endless months. It was May 1607, and the land the English chose to disembark was a marshy peninsula, infested with mosquitoes where brackish water mixed with fresh, creating a deadly environment that would soon prove to be a nightmare for those men desperate for glory and gold. They called that place Jamestown in honor of the king, but the true lords of that land had another name for it, a name that echoed through generations, whispered in the Algonquian tongues that the newcomers neither understood nor respected. In the palisaded villages that dotted the landscape along the river, where smoke from fires rose in lazy columns and women cultivated corn beans and squash in carefully maintained fields, the Powhatan watched the strangers with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Wahunsenakau, the supreme Mamanatawik, the chief of chiefs who commanded a confederation of more than 30 tribes, had built his empire through strategic alliances and calculated wars, and now faced a new kind of challenge: pale men who wore shining armor and carried thundering staffs that spat death at impossible distances. He was an experienced leader, a man who had seen many winters and knew the rhythms of war and peace, but these strangers were different from anything he had ever encountered. Their arrogance was as immense as their ignorance about how to survive in that generous but unforgiving land. The first months were a catastrophe for the colonists. They had arrived too late to plant, too early for the harvest, and their stocks of provisions brought from England quickly ran out or rotted in the humid heat of Virginia. Many of them were gentlemen, men accustomed to servants and banquets, who didn't know how to work the land or fish, who wasted precious hours digging for non-existent gold, while their bodies withered from lack of food. Diseases arrived with the fury of an invisible enemy. Dysentery, typhoid fever, malnutrition transformed Jamestown into a living cemetery where men staggered like ghosts among the precarious cabins, their eyes sunken and their moans echoing through the night. John Smith, a short and arrogant soldier with an ego as large as his ambition, emerged as a controversial but essential figure, for it was he who had the audacity or desperation to seek help from the Powhatan, to negotiate with those whom the other colonists saw as savages, but who possessed the knowledge that meant the difference between life and death. It was during one of these desperate expeditions in search of food that Smith found himself surrounded by Powhatan warriors, their arrows pointed at his heart, his life hanging by a thread as thin as a spider's web under the rain. What happened at that moment remained shrouded in mystery and controversy, for Smith would later tell a dramatic story of how a young girl, Wahunsenakau's favorite daughter, had thrown her own body over his when the chief was about to crush his skull with a ceremonial club, saving him from a brutal death. This young girl was Matoaka, a girl of perhaps 11 or 12 years old, playful and curious, to whom the English would give the nickname Pocahontas, which means something like Little Mischievous One, or she who plays a name that would become one of the most famous and misunderstood in American history. Whether the incident really happened the way Smith described it, or whether it was an adoption ceremony misinterpreted by a foreigner ignorant of Powhatan customs, no one can say for certain, but the result was that Smith returned to Jamestown alive, and with him came the promise of help. And the help came, abundant and consistent, turning the tide of the colonists' survival. The Powhatan began bringing baskets of corn, squash, venison, and turkey meat, smoked fish, and nutritious roots, teaching the English where to fish, and which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Pocahontas, young and fearless, became a frequent visitor to Jamestown, a bridge between two worlds, bringing messages from her father, and according to some accounts, warning the colonists about planned attacks, her presence a symbol of temporary peace in a time of growing tensions. Wahunsenakau had his own reasons for keeping the English alive. He saw in them potential allies against enemy tribes, suppliers of metal tools and weapons that could strengthen his own power, and perhaps believed he could control these foreigners through diplomacy and the dependence they had on his generosity. It was a calculated gamble by an astute leader, but he could not foresee the insatiable greed that would hide beneath the surface of the colonists' simulated gratitude. As the years passed, more and more ships arrived from England, dumping hundreds of new colonists who demanded more and more land, more food, more resources that the Powhatan could not or would not provide without limits. The English began expanding their tobacco plantations, a crop that exhausted the soil quickly and required vast stretches of land, pushing their borders further and further into Powhatan territory, cutting down the sacred forests where ancestors rested, polluting the rivers with their waste and their industry. The expeditions in search of food became increasingly aggressive, transforming into military raids where the colonists burned villages, stole stalks of corn that Powhatan families had worked months to cultivate, and kidnapped natives to use them as hostages or slaves. The trust that had been carefully built over years of exchanges and conversations began to disintegrate like sand between fingers, and the Powhatan began to realize that they had fed not allies, but a plague that would consume everything. The most shocking betrayal came in 1613, when Captain Samuel Argall, using the help of a rival Powhatan chief, lured Pocahontas onto his ship under the pretext of a friendly visit, and then kidnapped her, holding her hostage in Jamestown while demanding an impossible ransom from her father. The return of stolen English weapons, English prisoners, and enormous quantities of corn. Pocahontas, now a young woman of about 17 years old, was held prisoner for more than a year, during which she was converted to Christianity, baptized as Rebecca, and eventually married to John Rolfe, a widowed tobacco planter, in a marriage that the English proclaimed as a symbol of peace and harmony, but which in reality was the result of coercion, manipulation, and the complete destruction of the freedom of a woman used as a pawn in a game of colonial power. Wahunsenakau, torn between love for his daughter and rage at the betrayal, was forced to accept a humiliating peace, knowing that any attempt to rescue her by force could result in her death. The peace that followed Pocahontas's marriage was fragile and temporary. A pause in hostilities while both sides regrouped and planned. Pocahontas was taken to England in 1616, exhibited as a domesticated savage princess, living proof of the success of the colonial project and the superiority of English civilization, but she fell ill and died at 21 years old in 1617, probably from pneumonia or tuberculosis, far from her land, from her people, from everything she knew and loved, a victim of the same colonial arrogance that had devoured her father's lands. When Wahunsenakau died in 1618, power passed to his brother Opechancanough, a fierce warrior who had seen decades of English invasions and had reached the inevitable conclusion that coexistence was impossible, that the colonists would never be satisfied until no free Powhatan remained on their own ancestral land. On March 22, 1622, Opechancanough launched a coordinated and devastating attack against the English settlements, killing more than 300 colonists in a single day, nearly a quarter of the colonial population, in a desperate effort to drive out the invaders once and for all. But the English response was relentless and methodical, a war of extermination that would last for years, where entire villages were burned, cornfields systematically destroyed to cause starvation, and the Powhatan were hunted like animals through the forests that had once been their refuge. The English abandoned any pretense of civilization or justice, poisoning wine offered during peace negotiations, enslaving women and children, destroying not only bodies, but the very social and spiritual fabric of the Powhatan Confederation. Opechancanough tried again in 1644, already an old man who needed to be carried on a litter into battle, but was captured and murdered by an English guard, while a prisoner, an ignominious end for a leader who had fought for decades to save his people. By the end of the Powhatan Wars, the Confederation was destroyed, its lands taken, its population decimated by disease, wars, and forced displacement. The survivors were pushed into increasingly smaller reservations, their languages and traditions suppressed, their stories rewritten by the victors who painted themselves as civilizing heroes instead of genocidal invaders. The bitter irony is that without the initial help of the Powhatan, without the corn they shared, without the knowledge they transmitted, without Wahunsenakau's patience and Pocahontas's compassion, Jamestown would have failed like so many other colonial attempts before it, and the history of America might have been dramatically different. Instead of gratitude, the Powhatan received extermination and oblivion, their contributions reduced to footnotes and romanticized myths that obscure the brutal truth of a betrayal that would echo through the centuries, a pattern that would repeat itself countless times as the colonial frontier expanded, consuming nation after nation with empty promises and relentless violence, building a new nation on the bones and ashes of those who had once offered the hand of friendship to starving and dying strangers.